For 2,000 years, this forest hid the secrets of one of the most important battles in antiquity. Here, a band of unruly barbarians challenged 3 legions of the mighty Roman army. Now, archaeologists are piecing together the fragments of that fateful day. Hello, I'm John Rhys Davis. Join us at the site of a massacre that shook the Roman Empire. Next on Archaeology. It is the stuff of legends. The great Augustus Caesar hopes to push the Roman Empire beyond the boundaries of the civilized world. His faithful commander, Publius Quinctilius Varus, is inexperienced and untested in the field of conflict. Varus and his army expect little in the way of resistance. They are tragically mistaken. Armed with spears and shields, a force of German tribesmen gather to face the might of Rome. At their head, a daring young chieftain by the name of Arminius. It was one of the bloodiest battles of antiquity. When the slaughter was finished, 20,000 of Rome's finest lay dead or dying in the mud. So great was the shock that for years afterwards, Augustus is said to have beaten his head on a door, shouting, "Quinctilius Varus, give me back my legions!" Although the massacre left an indelible mark on history, the site of the battle disappeared in the tangle of an ancient forest. Today, archaeologists are reaping an unexpected harvest in a swatch of German farmland, hundreds of Roman artifacts. Have they found the site of Rome's defeat, the source of Caesar's nightmare? On a hill overlooking the city of Detmold in western Germany, an imposing statue immortalizes the young hero who stood against Rome. While the Romans mourned their defeat, the Germans celebrated it in myth and legend. But details of the battle seem lost forever to the passage of time. In the 1st century AD, Germany was a trackless land of mountains and forests, inhabited by tribes of warlike barbarians. Fiercely independent, they looked on the encroaching Romans with suspicion and dread. The century before, the great Julius Caesar had doubled the size of the Roman Empire. After subduing the Mediterranean, he turned northward and conquered Gaul, establishing a stronghold on the west bank of the Rhine. To consolidate Caesar's gains, the Emperor Augustus extended the frontier to the Danube. Next, he annexed the territory between the Rhine and the Elbe. An invasion seemed only a matter of time. But the Germans were ill-prepared. They needed a leader, someone charismatic who could unite them in a common cause, someone who could rally a force strong enough to confront a highly disciplined military machine. The young Arminius, only 27 years old, had unique credentials. Although a German chieftain, he was well trained in Roman tactics. As a Roman citizen, he had served in the army and sworn allegiance to the emperor, until Augustus made a fateful decision. He named Publius Quinctilius Varus governor of Germany. An aristocrat, Varus was also arrogant and tactless. His presence on German soil was all Arminius needed to spark a rebellion and unite the tribes. In 9 AD, Arminius seized his opportunity. He attacked Varus and his legions. After 3 days of fighting, the battle was over. 20,000 men, 10,000 camp followers were virtually annihilated. Unable to face the shame of such a catastrophe, Varus and his lieutenants committed suicide. Their voices silenced, Rome's most humiliating defeat in centuries faded into history. With few witnesses to recount the disaster, the whereabouts of the killing field also slipped away. For 2,000 years, no one has been certain exactly where the battle was fought. The search to find it would become one of the great detective stories of archaeology. It begins in the 16th century, when a manuscript written by the Roman historian Tacitus was discovered in a German monastery. Tacitus was the first to identify the Teutoburg forest, some 200 square miles of what is today gently rolling hills and woodlands. Over the years, Roman antiquities began to turn up in several different locations, but few associated them with the battle. Then, in 1987, an amateur archaeologist prospecting on a northern edge of the forest uncovered an unusual cache of new artifacts. The discovery attracted the attention of the Museum of Cultural History in nearby Osnabrück. The excavation, located at the foot of Kalkreiser Mountain, has yielded hundreds of tiny fragments, each a clue that here something dramatic occurred. After years of painstaking analysis, Chief Archaeologist Susanne Wilbers-Rost and her team have pieced together the uniform of a Roman soldier and the weapons he carried.
We found, for example, this hook to fasten the epaulettes of a chainmail coat. It mentions a certain Marcus Aius of the first cohort of Fabricius.
The first cohort was the elite unit of a Roman legion. The find is hard evidence that heavily armed infantry were present in the area.
This javelin clamp was used to attach the iron to the wooden shaft of a Roman javelin, a very long weapon. The base section of the javelin could be driven firmly into the ground. The sandals were very important. They were made of leather and had iron cleats in the soles. The helmet had a plume holder on which plumes could be fixed on special occasions. A Roman dinar, a silver coin. I don't know if you've already seen this. Look, there is a galley on it, a ship. Down here you can see the oars. We have several of this type. That fits into the context. But it's a rarity on this site. On this excavation, we've only found 6 or 7 silver coins.
These scattered relics of a Roman army bear mute testimony to an ancient conflict. But is it the infamous battle of 9 AD? Discoveries are a collection of copper coins. Wolfgang Schlutter, director of the museum, believes that they hold the answer.
Wir haben hier eine solche Kupfermünze.
Here we have a copper coin, of which we have found about 200 so far. These are surely only a fraction of the coins lost here. And these coins are the best way to date this event.
Roman soldiers were paid in copper coins. On one side was the hallmark of the Emperor Augustus. On the other, the stamp of their commander, Quinctilius Varus.
In the year 7 AD, Varus became the governor of Germania. Therefore, it was only from this date that he could put his stamp on the coin. So we can say on the one hand, we have found no coins dating after 9 AD, and because these coins were produced starting in the year 7, they could only have been lost in the year 7, 8, or 9. This would indicate that we have situated the Varus battle in 9 AD.
The location of the forgotten battleground now seems certain. Archaeologists have also excavated a strange-looking mound at the base of the mountain. their work reveals a man-made rampart some 600 feet long and 7 feet high.
Wir vermuten, dass die Römer von Osten kamen.
We suspect that the Romans came from the east. That is to say, they came from this direction and marched along this path. They were attacked from different ramparts, which in our opinion, the Germans had built for the ambush. So far, we have excavated only one of these ramparts. That rampart lies over in that direction, at the foot of the Calcrisa mountain.
Das ist die alte Oberfläche.
This is the old ground level, from the time of the Romans. It clearly marks the outer edge of the rampart. The Romans came along this path, just below here. Then they were attacked from the rampart and were clearly annihilated.
The construction of a rampart suggests Arminius knew which route the advancing Roman column would take. But how did he know? Wolfgang Schlutter thinks his knowledge of the terrain gave the Germans an edge.
Die römischen Truppen sind von Osten gekommen.
The Roman troops came from the east. Now, presumably, they tried to get through here, between the Calcrisa mountain and the Vian mountain range. But they had to admit it was impossible due to the high altitudes. They retreated and went around the mountain using the shortest path possible to surmount this obstacle. The Roman troops had two possibilities. Either they could march in a long queue for 10 or 12 kilometers, in which case they were vulnerable to attack from the side, or they could march in wide formation. But then they faced continual traffic jams at the narrow passage points. Imagine a three-lane highway narrowing to one lane. Then you get traffic jams for many kilometers. And that is exactly what happened here.
Schlutter's findings confirmed Tacitus's account of the battle. Varus led his army through treacherous terrain. On one side, Tacitus records, it was flanked by marshes, bogs, and swamps. On the other, by densely wooded hills. Here, they encountered the ambush. It is deathly quiet in the Teutoburg forest. An autumn rain chills the air. The Germans, invisible behind their earthen ramparts, patiently wait. Anticipation steels their nerves. In the distance can be heard the footfalls of the approaching Romans. Then finally, out of the mist, a golden eagle appears, the battle standard of a Roman legion. Troops, pulled apart by the long march, are caught by surprise. Trapped in close quarters, their spears and swords become useless. Combat is hand to hand. Within moments, the dying begins. Archaeologist Michael Geschter thinks the Battle of Teutoburg Forest was no battle at all. It was a massacre.
Diese kleinen Truppen römischer Soldaten, die eigentlich nur
These troops of Roman soldiers were only trained to fight in open fields. They were not suited to ward off small, partisan attacks. Because of this, they were massacred man for man. Isolated troops were able to fight their way through, others surrendered and were butchered. And still others fought on, but were overrun by the Germans, who were more familiar with the terrain.
The overwhelming success of their ambush may explain why few German artifacts have been found. Mostly the fragments of a Roman army literally torn to shreds, their bodies and their weapons plundered. How could such a disaster befall an army that time after time followed Julius Caesar into battle and reigned victorious? Christopher Ruger, professor of Roman studies at the University of Bonn, thinks Quinctilius Varus was to blame.
He acquired his experience in provincial administration in quite a different hotspot of Rome. Syria, that was at the time, Palestine. It was as turmoily, as rebellious as it is now between Israel and all the Arab states. There were factions, there were PLOs, there were Haganahs and whatnot, and Varus pretty well muddled through this sort of mess in the east. But he never had experience with a guerrilla warfare beyond north of the Alps.
Arminius dagegen war ein
Arminius, on the other hand, was a young German nobleman of the Cherusker tribe who had worked for the Romans as an auxiliary troop leader and had Roman citizenship. He was highly familiar with Roman military tactics. And this explains why Arminius knew the weaknesses of Roman military tactics when marching through difficult territory. His plan of attack in the Teutoburg forest was based on this knowledge.
Im Bereich des Teutoburger Waldes.
They operated in small units and on swampy, marshy grounds, in forests, as Tacitus recalls. And of course, the Romans were afraid of the forest, whereas the Germanic warriors just loved the bushes. They just loved the bush. They were able to operate very much more efficient in country like that.
Zum anderen ist auch dazu zu sagen, dass es im September jetzt
It should also be said that it was raining that September, and the Roman equipment became heavy since it was becoming waterlogged. The Germans, of course, had no armor, only simple wooden shields. Accordingly, their equipment did not become as heavy as that of the Roman soldiers.
When the Romans were ambushed, they were heading back to their winter quarters at Haltern, a heavily fortified garrison east of the Rhine. A team of archaeologists led by Rudolf Askamp, director of the Roman Museum in Haltern, have been excavating the site.
Das Lager von Haltern wurde wahrscheinlich.
Archaeologists now believe that the camp of Haltern was probably built around the year 0. The camp existed up to the year 9 AD, when it was destroyed in connection with the slaughter in the Teutoburg forest. We have evidence that one of the legions that went under in this massacre was the 19th Legion. It was previously stationed in Haltern.
In Haltern vorher stationiert war.
We have cleared the bones of the dirt and are now reinforcing them with plaster so that we can get them to the museum intact. Otherwise, they would break. Over here, we see the remains of the skull. We have only the outline, which we can just barely recognize. Here, I'm going around once. Next, we see where the spinal cord, that is the neck, was attached to the head. And over here is what would have been the upper body.
Archaeologists now believe that Haltern was destroyed by the Germans as part of a larger strategy to stop the empire's expansion and eventually weaken its grip on the Rhine. 6 years after the battle, Augustus, bent on revenge, sent his son-in-law Germanicus back into the Teutoburg forest. According to Tacitus, the scene lived up to all its horrible associations. A half-ruined breastwork and shallow ditch showed where the last pathetic remnant had gathered. On the open ground were whitening bones, scattered where men had fled, heaped up where they had stood and fought back. Fragments of spears and of horses' limbs lay there, also human heads fastened to tree trunks. In groves nearby were the outlandish altars at which the Germans had massacred the Roman colonels and senior commanders. Germanicus conducted several retaliatory raids against the Germans. Among his duties was an order to retrieve the golden eagles of the 3 lost legions captured by Arminius during the battle. And at stake was the pride of the Roman army.
Die 3 Legionen, die dort vernichtet wurden.
The 3 legions that were destroyed, the 17th, 18th, and 19th, never existed again. It was typical of the Romans not to reinstate a destroyed legion.
It was an unheard loss. Ever since Carthage and Hannibal's battles, it was the biggest blow to the Roman army. So many losses, 30,000 people lost. They could have recruited them back in a whiff, in a year's time, but it affected Roman pride. It affected the Gloria Romanorum. The big issue of Rome was the pride of its army, and that was affected. So it was much more a political blow than a military one.
Die Adler sind natürlich dann
The eagles were brought back to Rome, and then we don't know. Either they were destroyed or melted down in the course of the centuries.
eingeschmolzen.
The Battle of Teutoburg Forest once and for all put an end to the dream of expansion. Today, the monument in Detmold commemorates a fleeting moment of glory. But it also serves as a reminder. Without Arminius, the hero of Teutoburg Forest, one can only wonder how history might have been different. Blooded by the loss of his crack legions, Augustus never again dared turn a coveting eye on the lands beyond the Rhine and Danube. For him and his successors, the loss marked a first crack in the imperial shield. For the Germanic peoples, it planted the seeds of a national consciousness that would transform the ancient world. These death camps uncovered by Allied soldiers in Germany during the closing days of the Second World War told the true cost of Adolf Hitler's obsession with race. Millions of Jews, gypsies, and homosexuals, all considered Untermenschen, or subhuman, by the Nazis, and all consigned to the ovens at places such as Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen. Yet one story that has never been told is how Hitler's obsession with race bred a second deadly obsession: Nazi archaeology. Hitler declared the Germans a genetic master race, destined by blood to rule the world. Heinrich Himmler's dreaded SS dispatched archaeologists throughout Europe to prove it. Those archaeologists became the intellectual vanguard for a savage war of territorial acquisition and for an ethnic cleansing of the conquered lands that would become known simply as the final solution. It may be one of the grimmest tales in the annals of archaeology. Not the triumph of science, but the abuse of science. True evidence suppressed, false evidence exalted. So diabolical was Himmler's assault on prehistory, and so deadly the results for the conquered peoples of Europe, that German archaeologists to this day are reluctant to admit it ever happened. From this tranquil Midwestern campus of the University of Minnesota, Iron Age archaeologist Bettina Arnold has been swept up in a detective story reaching all the way back to the terror of the Nazi Third Reich. Arnold's investigative work is helping to write one of the ugliest and least known chapters in the history of archaeology: how German prehistorians once found themselves pressed into the service of Heinrich Himmler's SS.
Because the Nazis recognized the propaganda value of archaeology, they put an awful lot of money into it. And in the space of a very short time, from 1933 to the beginning of the war, the number of university chairs literally increased over 300% in prehistoric archaeology. In a way, you could almost argue that prehistoric archaeology in Germany today was really born during that time period.
In more than 40 years, no German prehistorian had ever written about the subject's Nazi past. The reason? Personal loyalty and fear of reprisals.
Most of the senior professors now were graduate students then, and they would no more think of, in a way, blowing the whistle on their advisors, who would have been major players in all of this as archaeological practitioners under the Nazis, than they would think of killing a parent. I don't think there's any doubt at all that there would be unbelievable peer pressure placed on a person who tried to break through the wall of silence that's been maintained on this subject.
Arnold discovered that the roots of Nazi archaeology go back to the end of the First World War. The Treaty of Versailles had humiliated a defeated Germany by stripping the country of its former territories. And in the turbulent years of the Great Depression that followed, Adolf Hitler's Nazi Party won the support of millions of impoverished Germans by again laying claim to that territory and providing a heroic version of their nation's history.
They recognized that for a people to be convinced that they in fact had a destiny, they would need first to have some sense of their antecedents being as glorious as their destiny was supposed to be.
In the same way that class had defined communism, race became the organizing principle of Nazism. From the writings of prehistorians such as Gustav Cassiner and party ideologist Alfred Rosenberg, the Nazis wove a crude racial dogma, preaching that much of Europe had originally belonged to the Germans, the elite descendants of a genetically superior people called the Aryans.
Well, the doctrine or the concept of racial purity had to do with the idea that this original Aryan or Indo-Germanic population had managed to maintain itself in a more or less pristine state and had developed most of the major technological advances that we normally associate with Western civilization, basically within the area that today would be considered Northern and Western Europe.
In their pageantry and politics, the Nazis venerated this mythical past. They took the swastika, an ancient Indo-European sun symbol, for their party insignia. And they believed that blonde-haired, blue-eyed Germans with an athletic Grecian physique were the purest descendants of their Aryan ancestors, despite the appearance of most of the top Nazi leadership. So enamored was Hitler of Greek culture that he would occasionally harangue dinner guests with a homespun account of how that culture originated.
One of the more bizarre notions that the Nazis propagated was based in part on a pet theory of Hitler's, that the Dorians were in fact a northern tribe that had migrated into the Mediterranean area and were the only survivors of some kind of a catastrophe in the north, and that they essentially then were responsible for later classical Greek civilization, which Hitler actually admired considerably.
Hitler had turned to the country's industrialists and bankers for the massive expansion in the arms industry which ended unemployment. Now, he would sponsor Germany's archaeologists for confirmation that the nation's destiny was indeed a Darwinian consequence of better blood.
There were two major agencies, one run by Heinrich Himmler and one run by Alfred Rosenberg, which both were heavily involved and provided funding sources for archaeological projects. And many of the primary scholars in Germany, the people who held the chairs in archaeology in the universities, and the people who did the major field work, applied to these two agencies to have their projects funded.
Though there were exceptions, most German prehistorians welcomed the Nazis' attention to a subject which had long been confined to the basements of most German universities. But it was a Faustian bargain they had struck. In exchange for increased funding, they submitted to the iron grip of SS Reichsführer Heinrich Himmler, a murderous bureaucrat obsessed with race and the occult, a man who would lead German archaeology into its darkest hour. September 1939, and a stunned world watched as Hitler launched a lightning war in the east, his tanks rolling in quick succession over Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and then a year later, Russia. It was the Nazi war machine's hunger for raw materials which drove it forward. But Himmler's archaeologists justified the pillage as the historic reclamation of a greater Germany.
There were many digs that the SS funded. Often they were in places which were not in the heart of Germany itself, but were in areas that were being added to Germany as a result of German military expansion, and fit within the program of Lebensraum, which was designed to get greater living space for the German people. And if, through archaeology, it could be demonstrated that these areas were historically German, there would be a greater justification for the current political reality of incorporating these areas either directly into Germany or into satellite states that were under German control.
The SS archaeologists swept into the occupied territories hard on the heels of the victorious Wehrmacht divisions. Among the sites Himmler's men dug were at Biskupin in Poland, Dolny Westernici in Czechoslovakia, and in Minsk, Dunneberg, and Dniepropetrovsk in the Soviet Union.
We know that the SS dug Germanic settlements on the Crimean, in the heart of Ukraine, in the heart of Russia, only to prove that Germanic tribes had settled there around AD 300, and to claim it for a greater Germany, for a big Reich in the 40s. And this is how you can abuse archaeology. And the Nazis did pretty well in that. But there were colleagues as well who refused to be serfs of this sort of nationalism, of course.
Headed by SS boss Heinrich Himmler, the organization which coordinated most Nazi digs was known as the Ahnenerbe, or Society for Cultural Heritage. Himmler was an extremist even among Nazis, obsessed with mysticism and genetic engineering. With backing from a group of wealthy capitalists called the Friends of Himmler, it was his Ahnenerbe scientists who conducted the diabolical medical experiments on concentration camp inmates. The former poultry breeder quickly bent German archaeology to his will.
SS archaeologists, part of the Ahnenerbe organization, were sent out by Himmler literally around the globe looking for objects of occult significance and archaeological significance. And Steven Spielberg's Raiders of the Lost Ark trilogy is to some extent based on historical fact, because in fact SS archaeologists were looking for objects like the Ark of the Covenant, like the spear that was used to pierce Christ's side when he was hanging on the cross, etc., because they were considered to be objects of power, among other things.
Few German archaeologists could have known how far Hitler and Himmler would ultimately go in the frenzied quest for racial purity. Yet their work played a crucial role in justifying the Nazi racial policies. Policies that led to mass deportations and ultimately to the gates of Auschwitz itself.
One of the ways that living space was supposed to be created was by eliminating Slavs and Poles in Eastern Europe, and this basically became easier for the Nazis when they were able to convince the public that these people were basically squatters living on lands that once belonged to Germanic peoples, and that Germanic peoples had a right to them.
Within Germany itself, Himmler's archaeologists made some of their most outlandish claims. In the 12th century, the Externstein rocks had been a sanctuary for Benedictine monks. For the Nazis, the caves were an opportunity, using fabricated evidence, to illustrate another glorious page from German prehistory.
What happened was that two archaeologists, Hermann Wirth, who was one of the founders of the SS Ahnenerbe, one of the original founders, and Julius André, who was an archaeologist, decided that this was probably the site where the so-called world tree of the Germans had been located, which was supposedly cut down by Charlemagne during the Saxon Wars, and that it had been a cult site, okay, the center of the Germanic universe, in a sense. They decided this basically before they had actually done any excavation. It seemed like a perfect location, and they then began to excavate in order to prove that that was in fact the case. And it turns out that there's absolutely no evidence for prehistoric occupation at the site whatsoever.
The Externstein digs eventually attracted such scorn from most professional archaeologists that Himmler was forced to distance himself publicly from Wirth. Privately, however, he continued to support him, cynically commenting, "Our teaching of German origins has depended for centuries on a falsification. We are entitled to impose one of our own at any time." Hitler privately regarded Himmler's archaeology as obsessive and somewhat of an embarrassment. He complained to his armaments minister, Albert Speer. "Why do we call the whole world's attention to the fact that we have no past? It's bad enough that the Romans were erecting buildings when our forefathers were still living in mud huts. Now Himmler is digging up these villages of mud huts and enthusing over every pot, shard, and stone axe he finds. All we prove by that is that we were still throwing stone hatchets and crouching around open fires when Greece and Rome had already reached the highest stage of culture." The Nazi leadership's main interest in archaeology was propaganda. The work of prehistorian and filmmaker Lothar Sotz, in particular, caught the eye of propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels. Sotz produced several films celebrating archaeologists and their attempts to recover Germany's ancient past.
Der Tode trug es während der Feuerbestattung umgegürtet. Die Scheide aus Holz oder Leder ist deshalb natürlich verbrannt. Und nur die Metallteile sind erhalten geblieben.
His films were shown widely before and during the war.
The idea was that you could reach people with images better than you could with print. Most of these people obviously never read any of the journals. But by showing SS troops sort of marching off to excavations, showing the excavations actually in progress, and with voiceover, in a way, extolling the beauties of the site on the one hand and the sort of cultural achievements of the occupants of the site on the other, and making the connection between the local population and this prehistoric population, that there's a continuous sort of line of settlement in a particular region.
Nazi disrespect for archaeological truth was finally extended to the sites themselves.
The SS archaeologists that were active in Poland partially excavated one of the most famous Iron Age sites there, a site called Biskupin. And when the tide of war started turning against the Germans in the east, the SS pulled out of that area. One of their last acts was to destroy the site almost completely, which you really can only interpret as an act of vandalism and intentionally done in order to make sure that no one else would have access to it.
So compromised were some German prehistorians by their conduct under the Nazis that even now there is a deep aversion to any archaeology connected to the events of the war years. That aversion would be most dramatically illustrated when researchers discovered the long-buried headquarters of the Nazi secret police beneath the wartime rubble of Berlin. Uncovered in 1985 near the old Berlin Wall, the most feared address in Europe was once 8 Prince Albrechtstrasse. It was here that thousands of prisoners were tortured in the cells of the German secret police, the Gestapo. It was here that plans were drawn up for the extermination of European Jewry. And it was here that Heinrich Himmler dispatched his SS archaeologists across Europe. Not surprisingly, no German archaeologist was willing to excavate the site.
Archaeologists would not want to get involved, many of them at least, in this excavation because it brings up the question of the Nazi past, and part of that past was archaeological investigation under the auspices of the SS.
We all know that Germans don't like too much to be remembered, to remind their Nazi history, because you can say that the whole German people were involved in this history, and that's one aspect. But the second aspect is that this special site, the Gestapo area, it reminds of who has planned the whole system and who has organized the whole system. And in planning and organizing, it shows that thousands and hundred thousands of people were involved in this system. It's another point of view to see it from this side than to be, for example, in a memorial of a concentration camp, where when you come there as a visitor, you can identify with the victims and feel very sad and say how terrible that has happened. But at the special side of the Gestapo center, you have to ask why that could happen. It's the question for those who did it and those who were involved and those who supported it.
Without money or official assistance, the excavation of the Prince Albrechtstrasse site was left to volunteers and an architect.
I suppose there's always a connection between material and idea, or Vorstellung, it's imagination. You can take a cellar in Pompeii, but you must know that it was Pompeii, you know. And this is only masonry of an old building here. It's a cellar, but you must know it was a center of the SS Staat, and it was the real center of terror, or the terror of this time.
Today, a temporary museum sits atop the site. The recent upsurge in violent neo-Nazi activity in Germany is convincing many that only by preserving locations such as the old Gestapo headquarters and fully exploring the part archaeologists played in the Nazi period can history's lesson be fully learned.
If archaeologists were in the forefront of the preservation of these areas and their development as teaching tools, this would be a major contribution and in some ways almost a compensation for the role that archaeologists played to foster some of the ideology of the Nazi era and some of their reluctance to be critics of the pseudoscience that was part of the race program for the Nazis.
The Faustian bargain struck by German archaeologists with their Nazi masters remains a cautionary tale for people everywhere. Tyrants will always try to rewrite the past to serve their own brutal ends. And archaeology must be vigilant not to become a tool in the pursuit of dangerous and arrogant national myths. Rising from the parched sands of the desert, in the land of the pharaohs, are the earliest stone monuments ever constructed in ancient Egypt. Though shrouded in antiquity, they bear an eerie resemblance to another famous landmark built 2,000 years later.
If an advertiser wants to sell his goods and give them a high-class feeling and make them seem classic, or if a bank wants to seem reliable, or if a university wants to seem respectable, the ideal thing to show is a fluted column, preferably in rows. And the idea of the fluted column is really seen as at the basis of European civilization. And when we think of the basis of European civilization, we think of Greece, we think of Athens, and we think of the Parthenon with its rows of exquisite columns. Now, the Parthenon was built about 2,500 years ago, and these columns, which we're walking through now, were in fact built about 2,500 years earlier still. So they're twice as old as the Parthenon.
For one maverick historian, the resemblance is no coincidence. He thinks the ancient Greeks owe a debt to Africa for their cultural heritage. If he is right, the history of Western civilization will need to be rewritten. But is he? Generations of school children have been taught of the glory that was Greece, of a white civilization that gave birth to cherished notions of democracy, philosophy, and science. But is it true? How much of that view is colored by racist attitudes of 19th century classical scholars? Today, a controversial new theory that the roots of Greek civilization lie in ancient Egypt has archaeologists in an uproar. What forces converged in prehistory to inspire the genius of the ancient Greeks? Who forged the destiny of Western civilization? In his book, Black Athena, Martin Bernal of Cornell University contends that the seeds were sown in Africa and the Near East long before the arrival of the Greeks. His search for proof begins in Egypt, at the famed Step Pyramid at Saqqara, the first ever built. Surrounding the pyramid is a complex of buildings and courtyards believed to be a replica of the palace of King Zoser at nearby Memphis, then the capital of ancient Egypt.
We're now at Saqqara, which is a place of firsts. It was the place where the first pyramid was built. It was also the place where the first fluted columns were erected, and the place in general where stone architecture was used. So here we have the beginning not only of Egyptian civilization, but Western civilization as a whole. That from Egypt and from these beginnings in Egypt, we can see the development of Greece and Rome and modern European civilization as a whole.
17 centuries before the birth of Christ, Egypt ruled an empire that stretched from the Nile to the Euphrates. Beyond, in the Aegean, was the island of Crete. Here, the empire of the legendary King Minos was reaching its zenith, while at Mycenae, the earliest roots of Greek civilization were taking hold. Connected by a vast network of trade routes, ships plied the seas laden with the treasures of the ancient world. Bernal believes that during this time, the Egyptians and the Phoenicians attacked the palaces of Crete and colonized the Aegean. Bernal's colleague at Cornell, John Coleman, is currently excavating the ancient city of Halif. An expert on the prehistory of Greece, he has found little to support the theory of an Egyptian invasion.
Personally, I don't believe that Greece ever was invaded by Egypt. There are very few documented instances of invasions of Greece, and we have no real evidence that in the form of, say, Egyptian language or Egyptian script, hieroglyphic, for instance, to suggest that, in fact, the Egyptians ever did come to Greece in any numbers.
Despite his critics, Bernal is intrigued by evidence that the Egyptians did control the Aegean. On the west bank of the Nile at Luxor, in the shadow of the Valley of the Kings, are the tombs of the nobles. Buried here are the most powerful men in Egypt next to the pharaoh.
We're now in the tomb of Rechmireh, who was a high official of the great pharaoh Thutmose III. And this tomb has the usual accompaniment of the affairs of everyday life, but it also has a great deal about Rechmireh's duties as this high official, collecting taxes, administering within Egypt, but also supervising the foreign tribute that was given to the pharaoh. And you have a number of ranks. You have the Africans and you have the Syrians all giving their precious objects, and there you have the Minoans or Cretans dressed in their kilts and bringing objects that we know archaeologically were of Cretan manufacture. So there's no doubt about who these people were.
Professor Bernal sometimes speaks as if they were bringing tribute, as if Egypt somehow had control of the Aegean area. But in fact, recent studies have shown that they're gift bearers rather than indicating that they were in any way under the control of Egypt.
Now, whether the Greeks considered they were giving tribute or not is another question, but this is the way Rechmireh and his pharaoh, Thutmose III, interpreted it.
While Bernal clings to the notion of invasion and domination, he insists it is not critical to his theory.
My historical scheme doesn't rely on the idea of Egyptian or Phoenician invasions or settlements of Greece. What I argue is that Greece is permeated with Egyptian and Phoenician influence because of contact over a period of more than 2,000 years, contact of all sorts, because the two countries are not, the two regions are not that far apart. To take an analogy, Greece is about as far from Egypt as Japan is from China. And we would be very surprised indeed if we found that Japan had no Chinese influence, but in fact it is full of Chinese influence. That's not to say that Japan is a mere reflection of China, but that you cannot hope to understand Japan unless you realize its Chinese roots in that way. Similarly, I think we should not do as the classicists have done and try to view Greece in isolation without seeing its outside roots.
The Greeks were undoubtedly influenced by the Egyptians in the case of architecture and also in sculpture. One obvious example is the large Ionic-style buildings that are found in eastern Greece and the eastern Aegean, such as the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus with its forest of columns, which resembles the Hippo-style halls of Egypt. As for all other things, the Greeks tended to transform the ideas that they gained.
The question of influence of Egypt on Greece in the ancient world is one that really can't be denied. There were certain aspects of the Egyptian cultural record which served as catalysts that enabled the Greeks to borrow, transform, and move on. So I would not, no one is really denying that the two nations were in contact, that the two cultures did talk to one another. But there are major, major differences in the way the Greeks adapted the Egyptian legacy. So to think, as some people have said, that Greece is really an offshoot or the child of Egypt is absolutely missing the point. The Greeks borrowed from Egypt, as they did from other civilizations, not only Egypt, turned it into something completely their own and went off in a direction. So, for example, if you look
Robert Bianchi, an Egyptologist with the Metropolitan Museum of New York, has joined a growing list of scholars who disagree with Bernal. He sees striking differences between the two cultures.
Something that the Egyptians never dreamed of doing, never wanted to do. So yeah, we have columns and architraves in both cultures, but the Greeks one have optical refinements that conform to their world outlook, and these do not appear in the Egyptian record.
The Great Pyramids of Giza are the most durable relics of the ancient world. The final resting place of the pharaohs, they testify to a fundamental tenet of the Egyptian faith: belief in the afterlife. To ensure the survival of the Ka, or spirit, the body first had to be preserved or mummified. Then, provisioned with food and surrounded by cherished possessions, the soul could depart for eternity.
The Greek mythology of life after death was remarkably similar to that of Egypt. The key shift is crossing a river by a ferry, which is a very Egyptian image for the way in which the dead travel. There was also the field of reeds, where the upper-class Egyptians lived in blissful happiness after their death, and this is very similar to Elysian, or the Champs-Élysées you have in France, these happy fields where you live. Then you have the word for the occupants of this territory, which is the same in Egyptian and Greek, Makarios in Greek, Macharu in Egyptian. So you have a number of striking similarities.
We have to understand that the Greeks, because they were using letters and words, were able to evolve an atomic theory. They were able to deal with invisibility. They were able to deal with how the universe was composed, what matter was all about. And that's a major, major difference. The Egyptians never speculated in that kind of rarefied way. This also holds true in areas of religion. Whereas, for example, the Egyptians believed that the body had to be intact in order to be reborn, the Greeks, on the other hand, would allow the bodies to be cremated. This is a heresy to the Egyptians because the body was now destroyed.
But it's interesting to note this may not reflect deep cultural differences, because in the United States today people use mummification, whereas in Western Europe they use cremation. You have this total difference in approach to the dead, which may reflect something about American society's materialism as opposed to Europe, but there's not much in it, and yet you have this fundamental difference in disposal of the dead.
The tombs of the pharaohs attest to their mortality, but to the ancients, they were gods. Absolute monarchs, they controlled the affairs of everyday life as well as the destiny of Egypt. In the conduct of politics, there was no room for the common man.
But imagine trying to maintain control in a land like Greece that's so broken up by mountains and sea. It's just simply not possible, and as a consequence, Greek civilization developed in a very different way, with local places gaining power on their own, and they never got together to create a federal state such as you find in Egypt, nor a great monarchy such as is found in Egypt or Persia or elsewhere in the ancient world.
And as a result, there was more individual freedom, more individual expression. The individual, as we know it today, as a concept, really is born in Greece, not in Egypt. Someone, myself included, I guess, would be really out of place in Egypt in a nonconformist kind of way with the way one dresses or has clothes or a hairstyle. But this is something that would be perfectly adequate in Greece, where they stressed the individual above a tyrant or a ruler in that sense.
Even in the Egyptian art, there was no freedom of expression. These paintings, breathtaking though they are, were not created. They were executed according to the dictates of the pharaohs. Artists painted what they were told, not what they saw. Highly stylized Egyptian figures appeared lifeless and two-dimensional, while the Greeks were beginning to explore the beauty of the human form.
The Greeks already begin to explore the body beautiful. The Greeks begin to be more naturalistic, more anatomically accurate, rather than stiff and rigid. And these two differences are also reflective of the differences in culture. Egypt was always a totalitarian regime ruled by a pharaoh. Greece was a democracy in which human beings and human thought counted. And when you look at an Egyptian statue and a Greek statue, you see that the rigidity of the Egyptian statue is the rigidity of a totalitarian regime. The naturalism of a Greek statue is a manifestation of the democratic principles that we know the Greeks formulated.
By 500 BC, the reign of the pharaohs had come to an end. Did the human spirit rise from the ashes of a dying civilization? Or did the Greeks invent themselves?
Greek is an Indo-European language, and therefore there must have been major influences from the north to make it one. On the other hand, there are an extraordinary number of elements of Greek language and other aspects of Greek civilization that are not Indo-European, and I believe these can be very plausibly explained as coming from Egyptian or Semitic.
The undeniable fact is, of course, that Egypt did play a role in the formative development of Iron Age Greece. That is to say that Egypt and its cultural traditions formed a catalyst whereby the Greek achievement was able maybe to get a spark and then develop. But what we have to understand is they are fundamentally different civilizations. Let me give you a case.
Backed by the archaeological record, most modern-day scholars agree with Robert Bianchi. Now it remains for Martin Bernal to prove his case.
My fundamental claim is not that Greece is a reflection of Egypt and the Levant. Clearly, it's a very different and independent culture. On the other hand, I believe it's impossible to understand Greece without seeing the depth of Egyptian and Semitic influences upon it. And this is what classicists have tried to avoid. They've tried to minimize something that I believe is absolutely central to the formation of Greek civilization.
Unfortunately, underlying the debate is the highly charged issue of race. Were the Egyptians black, as Bernal implies in Black Athena? Was Cleopatra black?
Was Cleopatra black? No, she was olive-skinned. She was a Greek. She was the Queen of Egypt, and her family had ruled Egypt for 300 years. But we know she was a Greek because the family was incestuous for 300 years. And so we're pretty sure about her bloodlines. Interestingly, the Romans tried to make her appear to be an Egyptian, but there's no question that she was in fact a Greek, and therefore the idea of her being black is not on.
The Egyptians regularly depict themselves in fairly light skin tones, and though it was surely a mixed population as generally recognized, I doubt that the term black is appropriate.
The word black is now used in a very wide sense to cover a whole lot of people who are only of mixed African descent. And certainly the Egyptians, if they were to go to Mississippi or had been to Mississippi in the 1950s, if they had wanted a cup of coffee, they would certainly have been refused.
We are living in a world in which people are beginning to understand the value of non-European cultures, the contribution that women are making in the world. And if we're going to become picky and start to argue and nitpick about he's black, he's white, he's this and that, we are losing the entire focus of the humanities, and we will quibble today instead of being able to live in a more enlightened society that recognizes individual difference for what it is, but preserves and bequeaths to our children and our children's children those characteristics of civilization that we deem worthy of preserving.
The debate over what role Egypt played in the rise of Greece has raised an incendiary question. Was Egypt black? Does it matter? It matters deeply to many African Americans searching for role models in the ancient world. Scholars, however, insist that such a notion represents a serious misreading of the archaeological record. The evidence tells us that the Egyptians were a multicultural people. Indeed, it may have been the varied tapestry of their society that allowed them to achieve so much.